Welcome to Module 7, Part 2, Gender Differences in Language and Emotion. 1. Gender emotion stereotypes and women's emotional double-bind. Do men and women really differ in their emotional experience, expression of emotion, and judgment of others' emotions? In order to answer this question, we have to take into consideration gender emotion stereotypes. That is, emotions are experienced and expressed in a specific social cultural context, which provide norms to prescribe the emotions that are appropriate to a given situation. The social norms on maleness and femaleness in a given culture powerfully inscribe our experience and expression of emotion as gender beings. Stereotypical beliefs on gender and emotion in Western culture and society affect display, regulation, and intensity of emotions. Gender emotion stereotypes believe that women, in general, respond too quickly and intensely to emotion, express emotion frequently, have difficulty in controlling emotion or coping with emotional situations, have other-directed emotional mode, that is, an interpersonal focus, that they are bodily expressive through smile, laugh, gaze, that they are allowed to express powerless emotions such as sadness, fear, shame, or embarrassment, and positive emotions towards others. Gender emotion stereotypes in relation to men believe that generally men have cognitive control of emotion and emotional expression, have a self-directed emotional mode, that is an achievement focus. They are allowed to express powerful emotions that reflect dominance, such as anger, contempt, pride, and that their reasoning capacities are unaffected by and in control of emotions. Gender emotion stereotypes have a descriptive and prescriptive nature. Descriptive norms are emotional behaviors and expressions expected from men and women. Prescriptive norms are emotional reactions that are considered appropriate for men and women. For example, women are expected to express positive emotions towards others, and it is not appropriately seen if they express them towards themselves. Women are expected not to express anger. Men are expected not to express sadness and fear, and to be emotionally in control. However, the emotionalization of Western culture has made gender emotion stereotypes become less prescriptive, particularly in relation to men. They are allowed socially to express more powerless emotions. The relevant thing is that gender stereotypes in consistent emotional behavior and expression is disapproved and sanctioned at a social level. Women's emotional double-bind means that there is a contradiction between the descriptive and prescriptive emotional norms assigned to women. Women are expected to be emotionally expressive, but socially sanctioned if they are, or if they are not, in control of emotions. I quote, "Women, more than men, are confronted with a dilemma because both their emotional expression, often judged as excessive and exaggerated, and their emotional control may lead to negative evaluations, facing an emotional double-bind." This is a quote by Niedenthal. Do gender emotion stereotypes reflect or create reality? Stereotypes create reality because they create expectancy and expectations about emotionally appropriate reactions, that is, the how, when, and by whom emotions are expressed. 2. Evidences of sex differences in emotional experience and expression. Feminist psychological research on Western individuals using methodology based on memory and reflection has shown how emotions are gendered from childhood and how girls and boys report differently the experience of emotions. In relation to guilt, girls tend to feel more responsible for the well-being of others and search being successful and have a mastery of self on their own. Boys tend to expect being taken care of by others. They're expected to break authority, and they search transgression of rules and recognition by peers. In relation to fear, girls tend to fear loss of identity, autonomy, and body integrity, and feel responsible for the dangerous situation. Boys tend to fear loss of face in front of peers when courting danger. In relation to anger, boys tend to feel offense towards their sense of place in the world and autonomy, and girls tend to feel offense towards the breaking of rules by others and the misunderstanding of their own actions by others. The conclusion of this study is that the gendering of emotion is more strongly marked on the parameters of social responsibility, autonomy, and the transgression of boundaries and norms. Following this study, we can redirect gender emotion stereotypes. For women, other directed emotional processes versus independence and self-reliance through mastery of self and the body. For men, self-directed emotional processes versus reliance on others' cares and recognition by peers. Experimental psychology and neuroscientific studies have proved that men and women generally show a higher frequency of, in relation to women, an affective memory based on sensory detail, having a quicker recall of emotional past experiences, a high affect intensity that results in self-referentiality and focus on emotion in situations, and an intense experience of negative and positive feelings, and the transferring of particular emotional situations to wider scenes. Cognitive strategies of rumination and negative emotions, emotional awareness to detect emotion in oneself and others, emotional knowledge to know and internalize emotional social norms, and the description of emotions in differentiated and integrative ways. In relation to emotional expressivity, they have a quicker response to negative stimuli, frequent emotional expression when in relation to others, and of emotions that signal vulnerability. As externalizers, they experience a higher expressivity of emotion and a less bodily response to emotion. They regulate emotions due to social and impression motifs, that is, to fit expectations, to regulate approval and judgment. And they frequently reappraisal emotion through cognition and social sharing of emotion. In relation to men, scientific evidence is found in that they have a more effective memory based on a narrative mode, a bigger amygdala that results in a quicker response to visual stimuli, a higher ability to inhibit emotional expression. As internalizers, they have a higher bodily response to emotion and less expressivity of emotion. The cognitive strategy they use is more generally is a distraction from negative emotions, resulting in less negative moods that have the consequence of generating broader conceptual categories, generalizations, and being more susceptible to persuasion. In relation to emotional expressivity, they have a higher frequency of expression of anger and pride, and emotions that signal status and power. They regulate emotion due to hedonic motifs, self-protection, and self-image. That is, to avoid unpleasant feelings, to elicit help, and to keep safety. 3. Variations in the expression of emotion, language, and gender. Feminist linguistic research has studied differences in women's use of language in socio-cultural contexts and interaction. To explain these differences, two models are used. The dominance model suggests that women speak differently because they are socialized, I quote, to soften and attenuate their expression of opinion through linguistic devices. The differences in women's speech found by Lakoff and Spender in the 70s and 80s suggest that women use a more tentative, powerless, and trivial language, use of mitigators in essential qualifiers and tag questions, they raise intonation in declaratives, and they use diminutives and euphemisms. Also, they have a higher frequency of using conventional politeness in order to show respect for addressee. The differences found in women's discourse and conversational style by Tannen and Cameron in the 90s suggest that women use more indirection in conversation, search for connection and consensus in conversation, and they use affective expressive meaning and sharing of emotion. The difference model suggests that these differences belong to a collective dialect that uses variation in language due to cultural backgrounds, such as ethnicity or class. Women use a genderlect as part of their cultural speech community. Regarding normative stereotypes in emotional expression, we can highlight that women are expected to be the chatters, but evidence is found that, in fact, they are more frequently interrupted and produce less amount of speech than men. Also, that women are expected to express positive affect towards others, but the evidence is found that women frequently express self-reflective emotions and self-consciousness affect. Women's double bind in discursive position is explained by Lakoff, who concludes that women are socially penalized for skewing women's language, but using it keeps them in the margins of discourse. Consequences of this marginality is a weak positioning in discourse and the use of linguistic strategies of indirection. In relation to access to discourse, women frequently have an idea-subject positioning with a weak stance, and I quote, positioning themselves as powerless, rejecting positions of authority from which they might successfully launch their meaning into discourse with a reasonable hope for their success, unquote. They have an access, in relation to their access to discourse, they show a less legitimacy and authority to engage in discourse. Regarding strategies, they use expressive strategies that require more cognitive effort to be decoded into meaning. That is, what is implied versus what is said is inferred by addressee. They use indirect expression of emotion and silence, not as a lack of meaning, but as indirect and implied meaning. Eckert suggests that we should move beyond dominance and difference models to analyze women's position, exclusion in discourse, and use of language. There is a more recent discursive turn in feminist linguistic studies that focus now on the negotiation of women's linguistic practices with the gender significance of ongoing discourse and the historical dynamic character of language. A performative turn suggests that social everyday practices, including what we do with language, configure gender identities. These two more recent turns allow us to move from the basic question of how do women and men speak to a more complex culturally questions that suggest what linguistic resources do people use to present themselves as a certain man-woman? What new ways of speaking and acting as women emerge? What kind of linguistic practices support particular gender ideologies and norms? Conclusions for part 2. Gender differences in the experience and expression of emotion have to take into consideration gender emotion stereotypes and scientific evidences. Stereotypical beliefs on gender and emotions believe that women are more emotional and more unable to control emotions and more expressive positive emotions towards others. They believe that men are able to control emotions and emotional expressivity, and that the reasoning isn't affected by emotion. Women's double bind in relation to emotional descriptive and prescriptive norms suggests that there is a contrariness or opposition between expectancy and appropriateness. Scientific and psychological research has shown evidence about women having a self and achievement-oriented emotional mode in relation to the mastery of self and identity, and a high emotional awareness on the self and others, and emotional knowledge of social norms. Also, that they use high regulation of emotion through cognition and sharing of emotion. Scientific and psychological research on men has shown evidence that they use other-oriented emotions in relation to the search for recognition and approval by group, and that they are internalizers, and that they have a high ability to inhibit expression. Dominance and difference models are used to explain women's differential use of language. That results in an attenuation of assertivity, powerless stance in discourse, indirection, and effective function of language. These models argue that differences arise from women's socialization by dominant patriarchal society or as part of a collective cultural dialect. Finally, the discursive and performative turn in feminist linguistics suggests that discourse and language are gendered as an ongoing dynamic practice in history, and that women negotiate with positions of inclusion in the cultural process. Social everyday practices, such as language, construct and can modify gender as performance or act, as well as stereotypical beliefs on gender and emotion. Thank you.